Okay, guys, here we are, part four, the age of Jackson. And, again, we see expanding democracy during this time period. Again, it's not democracy by our day and age, but for 1824 to 1848, this is the most democratic place on earth. You see the number of people that vote in the presidential election from 1816 to 1840 increases sevenfold, right? Um, by 1836, all states except South Carolina allow, I think it's 1832, all states except South Carolina allowed their presidential electors to be selected by voters rather than by state legislatures. And so while democracy is expanding, it is expanding only for white men. And there is, this has become known as the age of Jackson, or the era of the common man. And there's some truth to this, in that, yes, we do see universal white male suffrage achieved by 1840. Property qualifications for voting, property qualifications for holding office are going by the wayside. And it's also the era of the common man, because when you think about what is the most famous book written about American society in the 1830s, guy came to study prisons, Alexis de Tocqueville, and he wrote, that's right, Democracy in America. And here's this French aristocrat that is seeing the sort of future of government here in America, and he can't believe how classless we are. On ships, on ships, in boarding houses, like, everybody mixes, everybody eats at the same table, everybody rides in the same car, not like automobile car, right? But when there are primitive railroads, or you're talking about like passengers on a boat, like, everybody sat together, everybody more or less dressed the same. um, it's not to suggest we have a classless society, but relative to Europe, nothing like it. And as we see the franchise expand for men, we also see things like the nominating convention replacing King Caucus. Nominating conventions are super complicated because it's hard to even explain them today. But the bottom line is, the caucus meant that party insiders chose a nominee. A nominating convention is a much more democratic institution. You saw more state officials that were being elected during this time period as well. It's the beginning of mass politics too. Remember, we saw that clip with Davy Crockett, right? And he talked about going out and politicking. And he had his wife made the coat with the two big pockets. And so he'd walk up to somebody in Tennessee running for Congress, and he'd offer him a dram of his whiskey. And the guy would take his chew out, and he would take a shot, and then he had to cut off another plug of tobacco to give him a new quid, right? That was politics in America in the 1830s. It is becoming more democratic. However, it is 100% exclusionary. Women, Indians, black men, completely out of it, right? But relative to the rest of the world, we are seeing that expand. And there's a massive debate by historians, like, what role does Jackson play in this? Is he a political opportunist? Is he representative of this? Is he elected because he's a manifestation of this? Did he truly represent this in his policies? That's subjective, right? But what we can say is Andrew Jackson had a profound effect on the American presidency, and his name is synonymous with this. So we got a lot of stuff. We see the beginning of the two-party system, where we come out of the era of good feelings with the Democratic Republicans, and we now see sort of a split into the Democrats and the Democratic Republicans, and then the Democrats and the Whigs. You saw minor third-party candidates. Anti-Masonic was like, Masons are a secret society, and this party, which was the first to have a nominating convention, by the way, the Anti-Masonic Party, wanted to try to rid Masonic influence from American politics, and the Working Men's Party is pretty self-explanatory. So a couple of things here as we get down here. I know that it was here somewhere. All right, corrupt bargain. All right, so here we go. Here is Jackson, and Jackson has made his name in the War of 1812. And in 1824, we see a breakdown in the era of good feelings, right? there's one party, but 4 candidates. Who got the majority in the Electoral College? No one. Who won the popular vote? Andrew Jackson. What does winning the popular vote get you? Nothing. So you have Crawford from the South, Clay from the West, Quincy Adams from the Northeast, and Jackson, who has some sort of national appeal. So where does the election go? That's right, House of Representatives. Who's the most powerful person in the House of Representatives? That's right, Speaker of the House. Who's the Speaker of the House in 1824? Henry Clay. And remember, when Jefferson was tied with Aaron Burr, it was over 30 votes, right, to break the deadlock. How many votes did it take in 1824 to break the deadlock? 1, which made the Jacksonians immediately cry, corrupt bargain, because Henry Clay immediately became the Secretary of State, which was the most important job. It was a stepping stone to the presidency. Very good. So Jackson comes into office Jackson loses. Quincy Adams comes into office with an ambitious program, right? Of federal spending on internal improvements, building a national observatory for astronomy, right? Massive government support for industry, and the Jacksonian opposition kills it all. He gets none of his agenda passed because Jackson goes back to his, he's born in a log cabin, but he is absolutely stinking rich. He has a massive cotton plantation in Tennessee outside of Nashville called the Hermitage. And he writes these angry letters, right? These manifestos, and they get published by the Jacksonians, and there's organized political opposition. What did he call them? His memorandum. That's right. So now we've set for a showdown in 1828. And, it's called the Revolution of 1828 because it's more like is devolution a word, right? I don't know. I'd have to ask. Don't tell Mr. Manette that I was making up my words here with devolution. What's the election of 1828 known for? Mudslinging. It's nasty. It's popular politics, right? And everything. If you're running in the air of the common man, what do you want to paint your opponent as? That's right, some sort of aristocrat. And those are the allegations that are made against Adams. And of course, all of the other things, that caused him to fall into disrepute. Billiard table in the White House, gambling on the Sabbath, pimping for the Tsar of Russia. But it was that Adams is this aristocrat that represents the Eastern money corruption that had entered politics. It was trying to manipulate politics for its own purpose. Whereas Jackson said, here is somebody that is anti-privilege, anti-corruption. Linear to Jefferson, right, in the true democratic tradition, wise and frugal government. Meanwhile, John Quincy Adams gets right down in the mud too. And there's some bad things said, like, of course, supposedly Henry Clay linked to that Cincinnati newspaper that Jackson's wife married him, Rachel, before she was divorced, making what, a bigamist? Is that bigamy? And that was bad. Remember, we talked about Jackson and honor, and you don't insult another man's wife like that. And that adds to this massive, Jackson already hated Clay because of the corrupt bargain. Now he loathes him. And that is certainly going to be a big part of his time in office, influencing his political decisions. So it's a revolution in terms of the mass politics that each side engages in. And unfortunately, it manifests itself in nasty, nasty, nasty mudslinging. Because aside from the insults against Rachel Jackson and her virtue, remember, they paint Jackson as basically a sociopath, a madman. Remember, they passed out all of those coffin handbills, right? They were up on our website where it's like, hey, read all these stories of all these people that were in the militia with Jackson that he executed. Like, do you want a gambler, a duelist, a brawler, right? A military chieftain to be president of the United States? Well, Jackson wins, right? And when he wins, to the victors go the spoils. And our book did a nice job, or maybe it was our old book, something I gave you, did a nice job deconstructing that it's about 1 out of every 5, roughly, people that are removed from federal office, but it's the way they were removed, right? They were removed for one reason only: partisanship. And Jackson saw, you sell it as rotation in office, that nobody should be able to make a career out of politics. The Mr. Jackson, not this Jackson, but the Jackson, Tom Jackson, where he calls people political hacks, right? That somebody gets in office and then is able to manipulate the system to stay in there, and they're not a public servant. Like they're using it as their career, not to the degree of grafting like political machines did, but just that, hey, I've got this job and now this job is my right. And Jackson, this is like the ultimate, again, it's rhetoric, like separate the rhetoric from reality, but rhetorically, it's the idea is one man is as good as the next man, right? And that anybody could do these jobs. And of course, we learned about that idea, that example of the guy he appoints to be director of New York City Customs House. The name is excluding me right now. And rather than dwell on my incompetence, I'm going to move on. But that guy that he appointed, not Stalwart. It sounds like Samuel Stalwart. He took the money and run. That's right, Steve Miller. He stole close to $1 million, which was a lot back then, and then split town with it. So it showed that under the spoil system, sometimes some rather incompetent folks got appointed. Jackson inherits a major problem in that the Tariff of Abominations had been passed before he took over. This was a purely sectional vote. The South decried it. The Northeast loved it, and it drastically raised tariff rates. Drastically, right? Clearly done not to generate revenue, but for protection purposes. And of course, the South, being an export-based society, was only going to be hurt because it depended on trade with Europe. And out of that, just as we stay with that, of course, you have John C. Calhoun writing Exposition and Protest. Webster-Hayne debate is just the debate that took place in the U.S. Senate. Hayne was from South Carolina. Webster's from where? Massachusetts, where they talked about the tariff and whether or not secession and nullification were justified for it. But it's Calhoun that writes Exposition and Protest, basically dusting off that idea from the Virginia-Kentucky resolves that the states were the ultimate determinants of constitutionality, and very similar to the arguments that were made by the Federalists at the Hartford Convention. And Andrew Jackson will have none of that while he is an adamant slaveholder, right? And remember, he supported the gag rule in Congress where you could not debate the petition submitted by abolitionists. He censored the mail, right? He ordered the Postmaster General to ban any abolitionist literature from being sent south, claiming that it promoted domestic insurrection. And even though Jackson was a Southerner and sympathized with them on this and worked to get the tariff reduced, when people started speaking secession, Jackson was going to have none of that. He was above everything else a Unionist. And so he gives his proclamation to the people of South Carolina, basically saying, you are committing treason. But more importantly, he passes the Force Act. Well, he doesn't pass anything. He has Congress pass the Force Act, sometimes called the Force Bill, which authorizes the president to lead the army personally into South Carolina. Fortunately for Calhoun, he was not hanged. South Carolina backed down because Jackson was able to persuade Congress to pass a new tariff. Tariff of 1832 didn't reduce things low enough from the Tariff of Abominations of 1828, which is why in 1832 we had the nullification crisis. But the next tariff that would take effect in, I think it was 1836, which was agreed to in 1833, right after this, rates would be gradually reduced. So by 1840 something, they were back down to 1816 levels. So while South Carolina loses in that they have to pull back from nullification because they would have been smushed, they win in that tariffs are drastically reduced. So foreshadowing, as we talk about future sectionalism and how if you're in the North, you say the South wills disproportionate political influence, case in point right there. Some other big things with Andrew Jackson that we want to remember here. Role of the president. Andrew Jackson, again, is a Jeffersonian, very strict interpretation of the Constitution. He felt people that again, took a loose interpretation of the Constitution, broadened the powers of the government to serve their own interests, to serve their own privilege, to serve themselves becoming wealthy or their friends becoming wealthy through government. So Jackson vetoes. He vetoes more laws than all previous 6 presidents combined. He drastically cuts federal spending, vetoes the Mayville Road, partially because he didn't believe that internal improvements were the responsibility of the federal government, particularly when they were only in Kentucky, particularly when its leading advocate is the guy whose guts you hate the most, Henry Clay. Jackson could not manage his own cabinet. That is Eaton, not Ian. Okay, Peggy Eaton affair. Remember, Eaton is his, Secretary of War, and his wife, same thing, married him before she got divorced from her husband, and they had an affair while she was still married. Husband committed suicide at sea. Everybody's talking. Floyd Calhoun leads the charge in the cabinet, because remember, Calhoun is his vice president before he did resign in 1832. And the cabinet wives refused to associate with Peggy Eaton. This was called the Petticoat Wars, and Andrew Jackson could not make the cabinet get along. And at Van Buren's request, Jackson demanded that they all resign. And that made him rely on the informal group of advisors called the Kitchen Cabinet. And remember, the scary thing about that in democracy is who approves the Kitchen Cabinet? That's right, nobody. And these were all Westerners, largely newspaper men. Went over that. Let's see. Yeah. So Andrew Jackson had fought Indians his whole life and was very much in favor of opening up Indian lands in the West, in the Southwest. This is all east of the Mississippi, mind you, to white settlement, because remember, this all fits together. The Cotton Belt is expanding, right? There's a huge desire to move west. And he, at the only initiative he ever had, was asking Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act. And of course, he couched it as, hey, I'm doing them a favor, right? They're getting kicked out left and right. They're being attacked by the states. I'm going to pay to move them, and we'll give them all this great land in Oklahoma, because that's where everybody wants to live. And they'll gladly accept this. And ostensibly, there's a better one from you, Mr. Manette. Ostensibly, it was done out of benevolence, right? But in reality, Jackson wanted them gone and was going to, look the other way. It's a federal system. And the states, i.e. Georgia, were doing everything they could to kick Native Americans out of their land. And when the Cherokee Nation sued, all right, look, Cherokee Nation v. Georgia is very abstract, and the court basically punts and does not make a really clear ruling. It says that the Cherokee Nation really can't sue in federal court, and we're not really going to hear this case. But it also sort of hints at the idea that the Cherokees aren't subject to Georgia jurisdiction. However, in Worcester v. Georgia, where Georgia had criminalized any white man going onto an Indian reservation, Sam Worcester was a missionary. He goes on to the Cherokee reservation to help them. And he is arrested. He is sentenced to multiple years of hard labor in a Georgia prison. And the Supreme Court says, no, you can't do that. You're free. Georgia law does not apply to the Cherokee Nation. And it looks like a huge victory. Like, Georgia can't take state action to remove Cherokee. And Andrew Jackson, again, nobody knows for sure. It's kind of like, let them eat cake. John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. Bottom line is, he kind of looks the other way. And the states go right on kicking out the Cherokees, and the federal government then, we talked about this in class, make all of these treaties with all of these factions of these various tribes, and they're all gone, except in 1838, the Cherokees had refused to leave. A big faction of the Cherokees had refused to recognize the sham treaty that had been signed with the federal government. So under Martin Van Buren's leadership, the Trail of Tears takes place, where roughly 1 out of every 4 Cherokees dies on their forced march to Oklahoma. Then the big thing in the end of Jackson's first administration is the Bank War. Jackson hated the bank. He hated the bank because he was a Westerner and, of course, linked the Panic of 1819 to the bank policies. But the bank stood for everything Jacksonian politics was against, right? Unconstitutional big government, right? That had created this institution. Remember, why does a bank exist? Oh, yeah, to make money. This is a commercial bank. It just happens to be chartered by the United States government, not chartered by a state. And the United States government is the majority shareholder in it. But of course, you know, the bank's decisions had a huge impact on the economy. And of course, certain people could benefit from those decisions, such as the availability of credit. So Jackson is determined to get rid of the bank and do it all in defense of the common people. And so Henry Clay, ultimate political opportunist, has a chance to get even, and he proposes a renewal of the charter of the Second Bank of the United States in 1832, even though the charter isn't up until 1836. And the plan is either the bank will be renewed and I win, or Jackson vetoes it, because everybody thought the bank was necessary by this time. I shouldn't say that's hyperbole. The majority of Americans saw the bank as performing necessary functions for this incredibly advancing market economy that had been developing. Well, Jackson vetoes it, gives a long, remember we read part of it in class, this really long speech about how the bank is basically unconstitutional. Does it on July 4th for symbolic reasons. And then that is the issue in the 1832 election, where it's Clay versus Jackson, and Jackson gets 3/4 of the electoral votes, crushes him. But now it's time for vengeance, right? Remember, we talked about Jacksonian politics is vindictive, right? It's all about personal vendettas. It's very, very personal. So now he's going to stick it to Henry Clay. And how do you do that? Well, you kill the bank prematurely. In a massive power play, he withdraws federal funds as he goes toe-to-toe with the bank's president, Nicholas Biddle. Remember, it's like the Saturday Night Massacre with Nixon firing 2 attorney generals in one night. Before one would fire the special prosecutor investigating Watergate, the first Secretary of the Treasury says, "No, this is unconstitutional. I'm not withdrawing the federal government's funds from the Bank of the United States, putting them in pet banks." The Assistant Secretary of the Treasury does it. That won't do it. He's fired. And then Roger Taney, of infamy from what decision? The Dred Scott decision in 1857, becomes the new Secretary of the Treasury and puts all the money in pet banks. It causes a massive problem because, remember, banks exist to make money. These unregulated state banks are awash in cash, and it's loaning out money left and right. Skyrocketing demand for Western land, especially with Indians going. Massive inflation. Jackson's answer was to try to curb inflation by saying you had to pay in cash. Like, get your coins, take them over the mountain, and pay in cash for Western land. And it basically drained all specie gold out of the American economy, and precipitates the Panic of 1837 and the eventual defeat of Martin Van Ruin. Van Buren, who is the architect of the Democratic Party, had loyally served Jackson, and he's Jackson's handpicked successor to continue his policies. But he had a very impotent response to the Panic of 1837, and a new group, which is basically like a reincarnation of the old Federalists, the Whigs, are going to win in 1840. And remember what my man David Howe with the turtleneck on said, if the Whigs realized things would continue to be so bad, they could have run anyone and won. Instead of running Henry Clay, who was the real spokesperson for the Whigs, they decided to out Jackson the Jacksonians and nominate William Henry Harrison, known by his nom de guerre, that's war name, Tippecanoe, right? And what campaign do they launch? That's right, Log Cabin and Hard Cider, right? Where they had little ditties like, in English coaches, he's no rider, but he can fight and drink hard cider. And they would chant, Van, he's a used up man. I think those are the only 2 I remember, right? But again, it's popular politics. We see massive, big, what is it? It's something absurd. It's north of 70% voter turnout. It's even 80%. That was the stat that I gave you though at the beginning, where 1840 is kind of the year where it's like universal male suffrage is complete. And now we have the two-party system of Democrats and Whigs, which will continue until we have Democrats and Republicans. I think I hit it all. Boom. All right, one to go.